A simple farmer followed a black Mustang and ended up at an old cabin. But what he found inside turned his life upside down and put everything he cared about at risk. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The mornings on the Ride Ranch always began the same way. Long before the sun rose above the wide horizon of the plains, the air was already carrying the smell of dry grass and dust, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the small wooden house that had stood on this land for decades. Inside, the floorboards creaked under the weight of a man who had walked them for too many years. Jonathan Reed, tall, broad-shouldered, his face cut deep with lines from both sun and memory, stepped out onto the porch with a tin mug in his hand. He wore the same clothes he wore nearly every day: worn denim, a faded flannel shirt, boots that had seen better years but were still sturdy enough to do the work that needed doing. For Jonathan, life on the ranch was both refuge and burden. After years in the service, after the noise of battle and the company of men who never came home, he had wanted nothing but silence. Here in the open plains of the American West, silence came in abundance. There were no sudden explosions, no orders shouted over chaos, no fear of what lay just beyond the ridge. But the silence brought its own ghosts. Too often he woke in the night, heart pounding, convinced for a split second that he was back on some nameless hill with fire all around him. And then the walls of the small house reminded him he was home, alone, and the battle had ended years ago. Each day was measured out in chores. Repair the northern fence line, check the water pump, drive the small herd to a fresh pasture, oil the hinges on the barn door before the wind tore it loose. Every task was useful, every task necessary, and each one kept his hands busy enough to drown out the emptiness in his mind. Neighbors came by occasionally, mostly to buy feed or borrow tools, and though they respected him, they knew better than to linger. Jonathan was a man who answered politely, gave what help he could, but always closed the conversation before it went too far. The war had taught him the value of distance, and the years since had only deepened that habit. It was late in the afternoon when he first saw the horse. He had been working along the southern fence, pulling tight the wire that sagged from age and weather, when movement at the edge of the field caught his eye. At first he thought it was just another wild animal deer strayed from the foothills, or maybe one of the neighbor's stray mares that had broken free. But as the figure drew closer across the grass, he realized it was nothing ordinary. The horse stood apart from the land, like a shadow cast by the fading sun. Its coat was as black as coal, sleek but marked with scars that caught the light when it shifted. Muscles rippled under the skin, yet there was something wrong in the way it held itself. Around its neck the hair was rubbed raw, and Jonathan, even from a distance, recognized the cruel line of rope burns. Someone had tried to break this horse, and not with patience or care. This was the work of rough hands, men who treated animals as tools and nothing more. What unsettled him more than the scars was the way the animal looked at him. Wild Mustangs didn't linger near men. They spooked easily, and the scent of a human usually sent them bolting into the horizon. But this stallion held its ground at the edge of the field, ears forward, head high, as though it had been waiting for him all along. When Jonathan took a cautious step forward, the horse stamped its hoof against the ground, gave a sharp snort, and turned away with a sudden burst of speed. The dark body cut across the grass like a streak of night, vanishing beyond the low ridge. Jonathan stood there longer than he cared to admit, the wire still dangling in his hand. He told himself it was nothing unusual, just a wild horse passing through, but the image stayed with him even after he finished his work and returned to the house. At supper, he found himself staring at the fading light through the kitchen window, half expecting the stallion to appear again. It did not. The next morning dawned in the same routine, but the memory of the black Mustang lingered. He tried to shake it off, telling himself there was no reason to dwell on a stray animal. Yet when he rode out to check the herd, he caught sight of fresh hoof prints near the edge of the creek bed. Too large and too sharp to belong to his cattle, too recent to be left by anything other than the horse he had seen. The tracks cut across his land with purpose, as though the animal had come back in the night, circling, watching. That evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, the stallion returned. This time it stood closer, no more than 100 yards from the corral. Jonathan could see the ragged marks on its neck more clearly now, could see how the hide was torn in places, scabbed over in others. There was anger in him at the thought of what men had done to the animal, anger he did not often allow himself to feel. But anger was dangerous. It led men into choices they could not take back. He forced himself to remain calm, to simply observe. The Mustang pawed at the ground, head tossing, then bolted again, but not away. Instead, it circled wide around the corral and stopped on a rise to the west. There it stood, still as a statue, looking back at him. Jonathan felt the strangest sensation, almost like being challenged, or perhaps summoned. He knew better than to believe such foolish thoughts, but the feeling clung to him just the same. For the next 3 days, the pattern repeated. Every morning and every evening, the horse appeared on the edges of his land. It never came close enough to touch, but it never fled completely either. Always it lingered, always it watched before dashing off toward the distant hills. Jonathan grew restless. He told himself he didn't care, that he had work enough without chasing after some half-wild stallion. Yet each night he lay awake, listening for sounds outside, imagining the thud of hooves in the dark. On the 4th evening, as he stood by the fence with the last light fading, the black Mustang emerged once more. The air was cool, scented with sage, and the quiet was broken only by the lowing of cattle in the distance. The stallion raised its head, snorted sharply, and then trotted off toward the west. Halfway to the ridge, it stopped, turned, and waited. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. This was no accident, no random appearance. The horse wanted something. Or maybe, he admitted reluctantly, he wanted something from the horse, from whatever lay beyond his quiet ranch and its carefully guarded silence. For 7 years he had kept to himself, speaking little, thinking even less about what he had left behind. But in that moment, standing in the fading light, he realized that silence could not last forever. He finished the last of his chores with his mind already made up. Tomorrow he would follow. Not because he believed in omens or messages carried on the backs of wild animals, but because the veteran in him recognized when something was out of place, when a pattern repeated too precisely to be coincidence. The Mustang was scarred and restless, and there was a story written in those scars. That night he cleaned his rifle with deliberate care, checked the saddle straps on his horse, and laid out supplies as though preparing for a march. He did not admit, even to himself, that a part of him felt almost alive again, as he had in other days when each action meant survival. The ranch was quiet, the stars cold and distant overhead, but Jonathan's blood ran hotter than it had in years. When dawn came, the Mustang would be waiting, and he would be ready to follow. The morning came heavy with silence, the kind of silence that seems to hang in the air and demand a decision. Jonathan rose before dawn, as he always did, but the rhythm of his day was already broken. He moved through his chores mechanically, pitching feed into the troughs, filling the water barrels and repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. But his mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes his eyes drifted westward, to the low ridge where he had last seen the Mustang waiting for him. It was not like him to be led by impulse. Discipline had been beaten into him by years of service, hammered in by nights when hesitation meant death. And yet the thought of ignoring that stallion felt wrong, as if something vital would be lost if he let the moment pass. By the time the sun cracked over the horizon, he had made up his mind. He saddled his bay gelding, an old but reliable animal, and slung his rifle across his back. Into his saddlebag he packed a small supply of food, a canteen of water, and a coil of rope-old habits reminding him that a man never rode into uncertain country unprepared. He secured the latch on the barn, checked the wind, and mounted up. His horse shifted under him, restless, sensing his own tension. The plains stretched out endless before him, painted gold by morning light. Dust rose in faint spirals where cattle moved slowly across the fields. He urged his gelding toward the ridge, eyes scanning for any sign of the black stallion. It didn't take long. The Mustang appeared suddenly on the horizon, a dark silhouette etched against the rising sun. It tossed its head once, as if in recognition, and then broke into a gallop. Jonathan pressed his heels into his horse's flanks and followed. The pursuit was not a race in the usual sense. The stallion never fled outright. It ran just far enough to keep ahead, then slowed, allowing Jonathan to close the distance before surging forward again. It was as though the animal were testing him, measuring his determination. The land grew wilder as they left the open range behind. Grasses gave way to scrub and brush, and the ground grew uneven with gullies and low ravines carved by rain. Jonathan's eyes never left the Mustang. He noticed how it always paused on the high ground, waiting for him, ears flicking back to ensure he followed. Hours passed like this, the sun climbing higher, burning away the coolness of morning. Sweat trickled down Jonathan's back, and his gelding sides heaved with exertion, but still they pressed on. Each mile carried them deeper into country he had rarely visited, a place where cattle didn't graze and fences didn't mark the land. Here the earth belonged to wild things, and silence was broken only by the cry of hawks overhead. At midday he dismounted to let his horse drink from a shallow stream. He crouched low, cupping water into his hands, and studied the tracks on the bank. Fresh prints pressed deep into the mud-sharp, strong hooves, unshod and untamed. They matched the stallion, but they were not alone. Smaller prints crossed them, the faint outlines of boots, half buried by time but still visible. Jonathan felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. Men had been here, and not long ago. He remounted and pressed forward, the weight of his rifle suddenly more noticeable on his back. The stallion reappeared ahead, standing on a rise of red rock. Its black coat gleamed in the sunlight, and its mane lifted in the wind. For a moment Jonathan felt almost awed by the sight, the raw power and grace of the animal. Then it turned sharply and trotted down the far side of the ridge. Jonathan followed, the sense of being drawn towards something stronger with every mile. The terrain grew harsher. Scrub brush thickened into tangles of mesquite, and sharp stones jutted from the soil. His gelding stumbled once, nearly pitching him forward, but Jonathan steadied the animal with a calm hand. He recognized the landscape from old maps and half-forgotten stories told in town. Country where squatters once lived, long abandoned after droughts and fires drove them out. Few had reason to return, and fewer still stayed. That made the tracks of boots by the stream even more unsettling. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened across the valley. Jonathan crested another rise, and there it was, the stallion, standing at the edge of a clearing. Behind it, half hidden by trees and scrub, stood a weathered wooden cabin. The roof sagged in places, and the walls leaned under the weight of years. But the structure was still intact. Smoke stains marked the stone chimney, old but unmistakable. The place had been used, perhaps it still was. Jonathan slowed his horse, letting it pick its way carefully down the slope. The stallion trotted a few steps ahead, then stopped directly in front of the cabin, stamping its hooves as though to draw his attention. When Jonathan drew close, the horse snorted once, sharply, then turned and galloped off into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had come. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the cabin, the silence pressing in around him. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. A shutter banged softly against the wall in the breeze. Grass grew high around the steps, but the path leading up to them was flattened, the blades bent and broken. Jonathan dismounted, tied his gelding loosely to a nearby tree, and approached with caution. The smell hit him before he reached the door, the acrid stench of smoke, stale tobacco, and something sharper beneath it, like gun oil. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The hinges groaned in protest, and the interior of the cabin came into view. Dust motes floated in the thin light filtering through cracks in the walls, but the place was far from abandoned. On the rough-hewn table lay empty tins of beans, a pack of matches, and the smoldering stub of a cigarette left to burn out in a tin plate. A bedroll was spread across the floor in the corner, rumpled as if someone had just risen from it. Jonathan stepped inside, every sense alert. He knelt to study the ashes in the stone fireplace. They were cold, but only just hours old at most. He moved to the table, fingers brushing over the items left behind. A half-empty bottle of whiskey, a hunting knife sharpened to a fine edge, and near the window a cleaning rag stained with oil, next to a rifle propped against the wall. Whoever stayed here had left in a hurry but intended to return. He crossed to the back of the cabin and found another door leading to a lean-to structure, a crude shed built of mismatched boards. He eased it open, and his breath caught. Inside lay the remains of animals, scattered and stacked. Stripped bones, discarded hides, and the unmistakable stench of blood hung heavy in the air. Among them were the long, narrow skulls of horses. His stomach turned as he stepped back, jaw tight. These were not ranch kills or hunting for food. These were Mustangs, slaughtered and skinned for profit. Jonathan's eyes hardened. He had seen cruelty before, in war and in life. But there was something particularly vile about the waste of these animals. The stallion's scars made sense now. The rope burns, the wild panic in its eyes. It had escaped, barely, from men who hunted and killed its kind without care. And it had led him here, to their den. He stepped out into the fading light, scanning the trees and the slopes around the cabin. The land was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that prickled the skin, a warning of eyes unseen. He untied his horse and led it closer to the shadows, keeping it out of sight from the clearing. Then he crouched low, rifle steady in his hands, and studied the ground. Fresh boot tracks crisscrossed the dirt in front of the cabin, overlapping, careless. At least 3 men, maybe more. They were armed, reckless, and nearby. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Jonathan knew his decision had already been made. He could turn back, ride hard for town, and bring the sheriff here in a day's time. But a day would be too late. The men who used this cabin would return, and they would not hesitate to kill another Mustang or any man who stumbled upon their business. He tightened his grip on the rifle, the weight of old discipline settling over him like armor. Whatever waited in the shadows of this valley, he was not going to ride away and pretend he hadn't seen it. The Mustang had shown him the truth, and now it was his burden to carry. The cabin loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like blind eyes watching him. Jonathan eased back into cover among the trees, his breath slow and steady. He would wait. He would watch. And when the men returned, he would be ready. Jonathan remained crouched in the shadows near the cabin for a long while, listening to the land breathe around him. The wind pressed through the pines with a low hiss, carrying the faint scent of smoke that lingered from the fireplace inside. His gelding shifted nervously behind him, pulling at the reins tied to a tree limb, ears twitching toward every small sound in the brush. The animal sensed the unease that hung in the air, as surely as Jonathan did, a tension like a drawn bowstring that refused to slacken. He waited until the light began to thin, and the sky shifted from pale amber into a deepening violet. Only then did he rise from his crouch, rifle balanced in one hand, and approach the cabin again. The door creaked under his touch, but he moved with the silent assurance of a man who had long ago learned to keep his weight steady, every step measured. Inside, the air was close and foul, heavy with the odor of stale tobacco and sweat soaked into the boards. The empty tins and bottles on the table caught the fading light through the cracks in the walls, their metallic surfaces glinting faintly as if mocking him. He circled slowly through the single room, taking in every detail he had overlooked in his first hurried inspection. The bedroll was still warm when he pressed his hand against it, the fabric faintly damp with the imprint of a man's body. Someone had slept here not more than a few hours ago. Near the hearth, a set of boot tracks was stamped deep into the ashes that had spilled onto the floor, clear evidence of men moving carelessly in and out. His eyes moved to the rifle propped by the window. It was old but functional, its barrel cleaned recently, its bolt still carrying the sheen of fresh oil. Whoever carried it knew how to keep a weapon ready, and that told him as much as the prints did. He moved to the small shelf nailed unevenly against the wall and brushed his fingers over a scattering of cartridges. Several were spent casings, fired recently, the acrid tang of powder still clinging faintly to them. Others were fresh, lined neatly as though set aside in haste. His stomach tightened. These men had been hunting not for food but for blood sport, and their quarry had been more than just game. He thought of the black stallion's scarred neck and the way the animal's eyes had burned with something close to fury. It had not come to him by accident. It had led him here, and now he understood why. Jonathan turned toward the lean-to again, hesitating at the door as though bracing himself against what he already knew he would find. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning, and the stench hit him with full force. The shed was a butcher's den, crude and merciless. Piles of bones lay heaped against the far wall, their surfaces gnawed by dogs or coyotes after being discarded. Hides hung stiff and drying from rough pegs hammered into the beams, the skins mottled with blood and torn in places where bullets had ripped through them. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over brittle fragments. Several skulls lay half buried in the dirt, their long faces unmistakable. Horses, Mustangs, killed in numbers that made his chest tighten with a heavy ache. He crouched to examine one of the skulls, noting the clean puncture through the forehead. A single shot, point blank, efficient, cold, and utterly devoid of respect for the creature's life. Others bore ragged notches where ropes had torn across bone. The picture became clear. These men had run down entire bands of wild horses, roped them into submission, and then slaughtered them where they stood, for their hides, for their meat, or simply because they could. Jonathan rose slowly, jaw clenched, the weight of disgust and anger pressing against his ribs. He had seen brutality in war, but there was something about this waste, this casual cruelty, that struck him deeper. War was fought for survival, or at least for causes men convinced themselves were worth dying for. This was nothing but greed. He left the shed and moved into the open air again, drawing a long breath to clear the foulness from his lungs. The evening light was failing, shadows gathering thick among the trees, and with them came a sharper awareness of danger. The men who had done this would not be far. The half-burned cigarette, the warm bedroll, the fresh oil on the rifle all pointed to their return. He knew he had little time before they came back to claim their den and whatever profit they had stored here. He circled the cabin, careful to keep his profile low against the rising slope. Behind the structure, he found a heap of empty feed sacks and broken crates, some stenciled with markings from a supply store 2 towns over. He recognized the brand. These were not drifters living off the land. They were organized, drawing supplies from places where no one asked questions as long as money changed hands. Scattered near the crates lay bones far fresher than the others, still marbled with sinew. Flies rose in a buzzing cloud as he disturbed them. He pushed the carcasses with the toe of his boot and saw a rope still tied around what had been the animal's foreleg. They had dragged the horses here alive, bound and broken, then killed them at leisure. Jonathan rose again, his eyes narrowing. He followed the ground around the back of the shed, noting the deep ruts where wagons had been driven in and out. The soil was churned with hoof prints, both shod and unshod, and he read them as easily as another man might read letters on a page. 3, maybe 4 riding horses, several wild ones driven in, their tracks confused and desperate, and among them, the clear, sharp marks of the black stallion he had followed. He saw where the animal had been dragged, the soil gouged by its hooves as it fought the rope. But unlike the others, its tracks did not end here. They veered sharply, tearing across the slope, breaking free. It had escaped, wounded and scarred, and somehow survived long enough to find its way back toward his land. He crouched again, brushing his fingers lightly over the tracks, feeling the story in them. The stallion had been the only one to get away, the only witness left alive to what had happened here. Jonathan's chest ached with the thought, and though he was not a man given to fanciful notions, he could not shake the sense that the horse had chosen him deliberately. Perhaps not with intent, but by some shared recognition. A survivor knows another when he sees one. He rose slowly and scanned the horizon. The valley was quiet now, but the quiet was deceptive. Somewhere beyond the tree line, men were moving. He could feel it in the way the land seemed to hold its breath, the way the gelding behind him shifted and stamped nervously as though catching a scent on the wind. The poachers were out there, and they would not leave their spoils unguarded for long. Jonathan retreated to the cover of the trees, his mind already moving through possibilities. He could turn back now, ride for town, and bring the sheriff. It would take the better part of a day, maybe longer, and by then the cabin would be abandoned. The men gone deeper into the hills. The evidence would rot or burn, and the black stallion's herd would be nothing but bones hidden in shallow graves. Or he could stay. He could wait for them to return, study their numbers, their habits, and act. It would be dangerous, reckless even, but he had not survived war by shying from risk when the stakes demanded otherwise. He checked the chamber of his rifle, the familiar metallic click echoing softly in the dusk. His breath came steady, his hands sure. It had been years since he had felt this clarity, the narrowing of the world into a single decision, a single line of purpose. The cabin stood silent before him, a crooked silhouette against the dimming sky. But he no longer saw it as just a building. It was a wound carved into the land, festering with the cruelty of the men who had made it theirs. The black stallion had led him here, and now he understood why. The animal's scars were not just marks of survival. They were a warning, a call to arms. Jonathan felt the old weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, the same weight he had carried across battlefields where men's lives depended on his choices. He thought he had left that behind when he turned his back on the world and buried himself in the quiet of the ranch. But the world had a way of finding men like him, of dragging them back into its fights whether they wished it or not. The last of the light bled from the sky, and darkness gathered thick around the cabin. Jonathan settled into his place among the trees, rifle balanced across his knees, eyes fixed on the path leading into the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the hills. He listened, waiting for the sound of horses, for the low voices of men returning to their lair. And when they came, he would be ready. The night deepened slowly, hour by hour, and Jonathan waited, his back against the rough trunk of a pine tree, his rifle laid across his knees. The cabin stood in the clearing with its crooked lines and its blind windows, as still as a gravestone, yet it seemed to breathe in the darkness, alive with the memory of the things he had found within. He could smell the stench of the shed even from his hiding place, a foul reminder of the cruelty that clung to this valley. The gelding tethered nearby tossed its head occasionally, stamping against the earth, uneasy at the sounds of the night. Jonathan whispered softly to it, his voice low and steady, the way he might speak to a comrade in a foxhole, calming not only the animal but himself. The hours of waiting pressed on him with a familiar weight, a weight he had once known on long nights overseas when the enemy might move at any moment. He had thought he left those nights behind, buried in the dust of old battlefields, but here he was again, counting heartbeats, studying shadows, forcing every muscle to remain still. His eyes scanned the clearing with the patience of a man trained to read landscapes. Every flicker of movement in the undergrowth, every shifting branch, every rise of wind carried meaning. And then, long after the stars had filled the sky, the faint thud of hooves reached him. At first it was a whisper, so soft he thought it might be his imagination, but it grew louder, joined by the creak of saddle leather and the low murmur of men's voices. He straightened slowly, rifle held ready, eyes narrowing at the path that cut down into the valley. Shadows moved there, 3 of them, tall against the starlight, horses snorting as they descended. Jonathan's chest tightened, not with fear but with the sharpened clarity of purpose. They were here, returning to the lair he had uncovered, and with them came the danger he had been waiting for. The first man rode easily, slouched in the saddle with the arrogance of one who feared nothing. His voice carried ahead of him, rough and deep, barking a laugh at some crude remark. Behind him came another, thinner, his posture stiff, the outline of a rifle slung across his back. The last was younger, his horse moving uncertainly as though guided by a hand not yet confident in the reins. Jonathan studied them as they drew closer, memorizing the rhythm of their movements, the cadence of their speech. The leader, there was no mistaking him, spoke with the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. The second, the quiet one, carried himself like a marksman, his awareness sharper, his head turning often to scan the trees. And the third, the boy, hesitated in every gesture, his body betraying unease. They rode into the clearing as if it belonged to them, and in truth it did. The horses snorted and stamped, the men dismounted with casual ease, and soon the cabin filled with the sound of boots on wood, of gear thrown carelessly to the floor, of laughter and muttered curses. Jonathan remained motionless in the shadows, watching every detail. He saw the leader toss his hat onto the table, pull a bottle of whiskey from his pack, and swig deep before passing it along. He heard the scrape of a chair across the floor, the cough of one of them lighting a cigarette, the thin stream of smoke rising to curl into the rafters. The leader's voice rose again, sharp and commanding, speaking of the herd they had scattered, of the prophets waiting once they moved the hides. He cursed the one that got away, the black stallion, his words laced with anger at the loss. Jonathan's fist tightened around the stock of his rifle, the memory of the horse's scarred neck flashing in his mind. The stallion was alive, and that was its only crime in these men's eyes. The younger one spoke less, his voice uncertain, faltering under the weight of the older men's confidence. Jonathan caught the tremor in his tone, the way he asked questions rather than gave answers, and he saw in him the crack in their armor. Perhaps the boy had not yet drowned his conscience in blood. Perhaps he could still see the difference between right and wrong. Jonathan tucked that knowledge away, not as hope but as a fact, a tool he might yet use. For over an hour he watched them settle in. The quiet one took to cleaning his rifle, running a rag down its barrel with steady, meticulous motions. The leader barked orders, laughed at his own jokes, and cursed every horse he had ever broken. The boy fetched firewood, stumbling once under the weight, earning a sneer from his companions. Jonathan read them like he read a battlefield. The leader was dangerous, ruthless, but overconfident. The second was deadly, a professional in the way he handled his weapon, and it would be his skill that posed the greatest threat. The boy was uncertain, and uncertainty could be turned. Jonathan's mind moved as steadily as it had in the field years ago. He mapped the ground, noted the angles of approach, the cover offered by trees and rocks. He calculated the distance from his hiding place to the cabin, the time it would take to move, the lines of sight that each man might hold. He thought of the sheriff, of the day's ride it would take to bring him here, and he dismissed it as useless. By then the hides would be gone, the cabin burned, the men vanished into the hills. No, if justice was to come, it would have to begin here and now with him. The gelding shifted again behind him, and Jonathan pressed a calming hand against its neck. The animal's muscles quivered, nostrils flaring at the sense of other horses nearby. Jonathan's own pulse beat steady, his breath measured. He had lived 7 years in silence, letting the land wash over him, but tonight that silence was broken. War had returned, not in uniform or foreign soil, but in the raw lawlessness of men who killed without care. He had thought he could bury that part of himself, but the truth was laid bare in the valley. He had been forged for moments such as this. Inside the cabin, the leader rose and began to pace, speaking of another hunt, of rounding up what remained of the herd. He mentioned the black stallion again, his words thick with venom. Jonathan leaned closer, his jaw tightening. He could almost feel the animal's presence out there in the darkness. Watching from the ridges as it had so many nights before, it had brought him here, shown him this place, and now its fate was bound with his own decision. The boy yawned, earning a barked insult from the leader. The quiet one said nothing, his attention fixed on the rifle in his lap. Jonathan knew then that the time for waiting would soon end. The longer he lingered, the greater the chance of discovery. He needed to act, but not yet. He forced himself to remain still, to let the night draw them deeper into complacency. Patience had saved him more than once, and it would save him now. The moon lifted over the ridge, casting silver light across the clearing. Shadows stretched long, and the men inside the cabin grew louder, less cautious, dulled by drink and the false security of their den. Jonathan shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his grip on the rifle. He studied their every move, the positions they took, the spaces they left uncovered. Soon he would decide. Soon the silence of the valley would be shattered. But for now he waited, his mind as sharp and steady as it had ever been, every sense tuned to the moment. The poachers had returned, and with them came the reckoning they did not yet know awaited them. The moon hung high above the valley, its pale glow washing the clearing in a ghostly light. Jonathan remained in his place among the trees, the cold weight of the rifle across his knees, watching as the poachers settled deeper into their evening. They had grown louder as the night dragged on, voices roughened by drink, movements sloppy with overconfidence. Yet Jonathan knew better than to mistake carelessness for weakness. A wolf drunk on the scent of blood was still a wolf, and these men had already shown what they were capable of in the shed of bones behind the cabin. He felt the old rhythm of patience steady his body, the same patience that had once kept him alive when ambushes and skirmishes stretched through long nights. He breathed evenly, counting seconds with each rise and fall of his chest. The land around him was utterly still, except for the shifting of his gelding, tethered farther back in the trees. Then, as the laughter inside the cabin swelled, Jonathan decided the moment had come. He moved like a shadow, easing backward into the deeper cover of the pines, circling wide around the clearing until he reached the slope above. From there he had a clear view of the cabin, the shed, and the men's horses tied just beyond. The animals were restless, stamping and tossing their heads as though sensing the unease that Jonathan felt in his bones. He studied the terrain carefully, memorizing every angle, every line of fire, every obstacle that might serve as cover. His plan formed as naturally as breathing. First, scatter their mounts, then draw the men into the open, away from the protection of the walls. Jonathan pulled a stone from the ground and weighed it in his palm. Then, with the precision of long practice, he hurled it into the darkness, where it clattered sharply against the metal rim of a discarded pan near the horses. The animals spooked instantly, rearing and snorting, jerking against their ropes. The sudden commotion carried through the clearing like thunder. Inside the cabin, voices rose in confusion. Chairs scraped, boots pounded against the floor, and then the door burst open. The leader came first, cursing as he strode into the moonlight, his pistol drawn but pointed lazily toward the ground. The quiet one followed, rifle in hand, eyes already scanning the tree line with practiced caution. The boy lingered in the doorway, uncertain, clutching a lantern that spilled a trembling light across the cabin steps. Jonathan lowered himself against the slope, steadying his breath. The leader barked an order to the younger man, telling him to calm the horses, and the boy hesitated before moving toward them, lantern swaying in his grip. Jonathan took the opportunity. He shifted into a crouch, raised his rifle, and fired a single shot into the air above the horses. The crack shattered the night, echoing through the valley. The animals bolted in panic, ripping free of their ties, scattering into the trees with wild cries. The boy stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern, while the leader shouted and raised his pistol toward the slope. The quiet one dropped to a knee in the dirt, rifle braced against his shoulder, scanning for the source of the shot. Jonathan slid deeper into cover, the smell of powder sharp in his nose, his pulse steady despite the chaos below. He had their attention now, and more importantly, he had stripped them of their mounts. They were trapped in the clearing with nowhere to run. The leader shouted again, his words a mix of fury and command, demanding the shooter reveal himself. His voice carried a false bravado, but Jonathan heard the edge beneath it. Men who hunted animals for sport were quick to anger when the roles were reversed. The quiet one fired a shot into the trees, the bullet striking a trunk not far from where Jonathan crouched. Bark exploded in a sharp spray, but Jonathan did not flinch. He eased along the slope, careful to leave no sound of movement, and repositioned behind a fallen log. From there, he sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger. His shot struck the dirt at the leader's feet, close enough to send the man stumbling backward with a curse. The message was clear. The boy cried out in panic, the lantern shaking wildly in his hand. Jonathan held his fire, watching the young man's fear spill into the open. He did not want to kill the boy if it could be avoided. His war had taught him to recognize those who were already too far gone, and those who might still be pulled back. The leader, however, was another matter. That man's cruelty was written in every scar on the Mustang, in every bone piled in the shed. The leader shouted again, this time aiming his pistol blindly toward the ridge and firing. The shot went wide, its echo rolling across the valley. The quiet one rose from his knee and advanced cautiously, his rifle ready, his eyes sharp. Jonathan tracked his movements carefully, knowing this man was the real threat. He shifted his position once more, keeping the advantage of height and shadow. The boy hovered near the cabin, torn between fleeing inside and following orders. The night erupted fully when the leader, driven by rage, charged toward the shed, shouting that he would flush out the shooter himself. Jonathan let him come, waiting until the man had crossed halfway into the clearing before firing again, the bullet striking a plank of the shed in a sharp burst of splinters. The leader ducked, cursed, and rolled behind a stack of crates, his bravado fraying at the edges. The quiet one returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, forcing Jonathan to keep low. Each crack of the rifle sent chips of bark flying, each echo a reminder that this was no drunken fool, but a man accustomed to killing. Jonathan's mind worked quickly, weighing options, calculating risks. He could stay on the ridge and keep them pinned down, but ammunition was not endless. He could move closer, draw them into close quarters where his skills might turn the tide, but that would risk exposure. The boys' indecision remained the only weak point, the only chance to fracture their strength without bloodshed. A sudden sound cut through the chaos, the shrill, piercing cry of a horse. Jonathan's heart leapt as the black Mustang burst from the shadows of the trees. Its dark form streaked across the clearing, hooves striking the earth like drumbeats. The poachers shouted in alarm, the boy dropping the lantern in shock as the animal charged past him. The stallion barreled straight toward the crates where the leader hid, teeth bared, eyes wild with fury. The man scrambled to his feet, firing wildly, but the horse's hooves struck out, knocking him to the ground with a scream. Jonathan seized the moment. He rose from cover and fired at the quiet one, his shot grazing the man's shoulder and sending him staggering. The boy froze, his eyes wide with terror, his hands empty. Jonathan shouted down from the ridge, his voice low but commanding, telling the boy to drop whatever weapon he carried. The young man obeyed instantly, his fear spilling into surrender. The leader cursed from the dirt, scrambling to his knees, while the quiet one clutched his bleeding shoulder, his rifle slipping from his grasp. The clearing was chaos now, firelight from the fallen lantern flickering across the ground, shadows leaping wildly as the Mustang circled back, snorting and pawing at the earth. Jonathan advanced down the slope, rifle steady, every step measured. The boy raised his hands in surrender, backing toward the cabin. The leader spat curses, promising death, while the quiet one tried to steady himself, blood running down his arm. Jonathan knew the fight was not yet done. These men would not yield easily, and he could not allow himself to falter. But he also knew the balance had shifted. The poachers had expected another night of safety in their den, but the land itself had turned against them. And he, once a man content to hide in silence, now stood once more in the fire of confrontation. The black Mustang reared, its silhouette cutting sharp against the moon, and Jonathan raised his rifle again, ready to end what had begun. The night of reckoning had arrived, and there would be no turning back. The clearing still shook with echoes of gunfire, and the acrid smell of powder clung to the air as Jonathan advanced slowly, his rifle steady, his eyes never leaving the three figures before him. The leader crouched low, one hand pressed against the dirt, the other clutching his pistol, though his wrist trembled from the blow he had taken when the Mustang struck him down. The quiet one knelt a few yards away, his rifle abandoned at his side, his shoulder bleeding freely down the length of his sleeve. The boy stood frozen near the doorway of the cabin, hands raised in the flickering light of the fallen lantern, his face pale and drawn tight with fear. The Mustang circled them like a phantom, its breath steaming in the cold air, hooves striking the earth in restless fury, as if it too had sworn to see this reckoning through. Jonathan kept walking until the rifle's barrel was leveled directly at the leader's chest. The man sneered through a grimace of pain, trying to mask his weakness with defiance. His mouth opened to curse, but Jonathan cut him off with a voice low and sharp, commanding him to drop the weapon. For a moment, the leader's eyes flickered, torn between pride and survival. Then he let the pistol fall into the dirt. Jonathan shifted his gaze to the quiet one, who already sat back on his heels, pale from blood loss, his hands raised half in surrender. The boy needed no instruction. His weapon had been discarded long before, and now he stood trembling like a sapling in a storm. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the labored breathing of men who had been forced to admit defeat. Jonathan moved closer, never lowering his rifle, and with swift, practiced motions he kicked the pistols aside, sending them skittering across the dirt. The Mustang pawed at the ground once more before retreating to the edge of the clearing, nostrils flaring, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Jonathan allowed himself a single glance at the animal, a silent acknowledgement of its part in this fight, before turning his attention fully back to the men. He ordered the boy forward first, his voice sharp but not cruel, and the young man obeyed, his steps hesitant, his eyes darting between the fallen weapons and Jonathan's steady aim. Jonathan pulled a coil of rope from his saddlebag and bound the boy's hands firmly, his knots quick and unyielding. The boy did not resist, and Jonathan sensed that beneath the fear there was a strange relief, as though some part of him was glad to be pulled from the grip of men more ruthless than himself. Next he moved to the quiet one, whose wound made resistance impossible. Jonathan pressed him to the ground with a knee and tied his arms behind him, ignoring the man's hiss of pain. Finally he came to the leader, whose glare burned with hatred even as his strength ebbed. Jonathan bound him tighter than the others, knowing that if anyone here would find a way to strike back, it would be him. The man muttered threats under his breath, swearing vengeance, but Jonathan did not answer. He had heard such words before on darker nights in faraway lands, and they had never swayed him. When the three were secured, Jonathan stepped back and lowered his rifle at last. The sudden weight of exhaustion settled into his bones, the long night pressing down on him all at once. He looked toward the shed where the bones and hides lay, the grotesque testament to the cruelty these men had carried out. He thought of the Mustang, the lone survivor of that slaughter, and felt a cold satisfaction that the men who had done it now lay in ropes at his feet. Yet satisfaction was not triumph. The herd was gone, the loss permanent, and the valley would carry the memory of it long after this night. He returned to his horse and retrieved his canteen, drinking deeply before pouring some of the cool water over his face. Then he turned back to the captives, studying them in silence. The boy sat with his head bowed, shoulders slumped, as though a great weight had finally broken him. The quiet one leaned heavily against the wall of the cabin, his eyes fixed on nothing, his body slack with pain. The leader alone still fought in spirit, his eyes glittering with hatred, his jaw tight. Jonathan knew such men never changed. They only waited for another chance to spill blood. The rest of the night passed slowly. Jonathan kept watch, pacing the edge of the clearing, rifle always close at hand. The Mustang lingered on the ridge above, a dark silhouette against the fading stars, as though it too stood sentinel. When the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, Jonathan knew what had to be done. He could not simply leave the men bound here, nor could he take justice into his own hands as he might once have been tempted to. His war had taught him the cost of vengeance, and though part of him burned to deliver punishment himself, another part, the part that had clung stubbornly to a sense of honor, knew that the law must have its turn. He roused the boy first, forcing him to his feet and tying him to one of the horses that had not bolted into the night. Then he pulled the other two upright, ignoring their curses and groans, and lashed them together with ropes strong enough to hold through the long ride. The journey back to town would be slow and difficult, but it was the only way. He mounted his gelding and set the small column moving, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes always scanning the land for danger. The trail was long, but Jonathan's mind remained sharp despite his weariness. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo with the choices he had made. He had lived in silence for 7 years, hiding from the weight of what war and loss had left behind, and in one night that silence had been broken. He had chosen to act, to fight again, and though it had cost him blood and peace, he felt something stir within him that had been absent for far too long. Purpose. By the time the sun climbed high and the town came into view, dust rising from its streets, Jonathan was coated in sweat and dust, his muscles aching from the strain. He rode into the main street with the prisoners trailing behind him, bound and broken, the sight drawing townsfolk from their doorways. Murmurs spread quickly, men and women pointing, whispering. They knew Jonathan Reed as the solitary rancher, the veteran who kept to himself, but now they saw him return with the very men who had terrorized the land, men whose crimes had been spoken of in hushed tones for months. At the sheriff's office, Jonathan dismounted and dragged the prisoners inside, delivering them into the hands of the law. The sheriff, a grizzled man with weary eyes, looked from Jonathan to the bound men and back again, and in his gaze was something like respect. Papers were signed, statements taken, and by the end of the day the poachers sat in the town jail, their fates sealed by the evidence Jonathan had gathered and the testimony he would give. When the formalities were over, Jonathan stepped out into the street once more. The town bustled around him, life moving as it always did. But for him, the world felt changed. He turned his eyes toward the horizon, where the ridges rose in the distance, and for a moment he thought he saw the black Mustang there, standing tall against the fading light. Then it was gone, vanished into the wild as it was meant to be. That evening he returned to his ranch, weary but strangely lighter. He unsaddled his gelding, brushed the dust from its coat, and let it loose in the corral. Then he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, cooling in his hands, staring out across the plains. The silence of the land stretched before him, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt alive again, filled with possibility. He thought of the Mustang's scars, of the fight in its eyes, and realized that in some way the animal had given him back a part of himself he had thought lost forever. He had come here 7 years ago to hide, to bury his ghost in the solitude of the ranch. But the world had found him, drawn him into its struggle, and reminded him that some battles cannot be ignored. He was a soldier still, not in uniform, not carrying the flag of any cause but his own, yet no less bound to the duty of standing against cruelty when it reared its head. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to prick the sky, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the rifle resting against the wall beside him. His life would never be simple again, but perhaps it was never meant to be. The Mustang had shown him that even scars could be carried with strength, and that freedom, once fought for, must always be defended. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep came without the shadows of war pressing close. The land was quiet once more, but within that quiet lay not retreat, but resolve. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next tale. Tap the bell to be the first to watch new videos and dive into the next incredible story waiting for you on screen right now. And if this one kept you hooked, share it with your friends. Let them experience it too.